Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Good morning, evening, and afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining. Um, Before we get started, I just want to mention a couple of the features of the Zoom. The chat and the Q&A feature are both open. If you have a question during the talk, feel free to put it there and we'll get to it at the end. The closed captioning is also turned on, and if you would like to use that, feel free to do so. And then finally, before we get started, I want to remind everyone that if you want to suggest a future speaker in this series, we have a suggestion form on the website, and I will include the link to that in the chat. We really appreciate any suggestions because it helps us make sure that we get speakers that everyone wants to hear from. So without further ado, I want to welcome today's speaker, Dr. Gemma Cremen. Dr. Cremen received her PhD in earthquake engineering at Stanford University and is now an assistant professor in risk and resilience engineering at University College London. Her work involves developing innovative disaster risk management tools with the aim of improving societal decision-making on issues related to urban infrastructure, risk, and resilience. So thank you so much for joining us today. And without further ado, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Julia. So I'll just share my presentation and get started. Yeah, so it's great to be here today. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the work that's been going on in my group over the last few years or so. So as Juliet mentioned, I'm an earthquake engineer and a risk modeler by background. So maybe perhaps the topic that I sort of focus on in today's talk is slightly different to sort of more of the more fundamental hazard modeling that you might have seen during previous talks in the series. So I'm going to talk about generally people-centered approaches to modeling and decision making on future earthquake and generally natural hazard risk. So why is this type of approach important? Well, we know that across the world, populations are rapidly growing. Our world is becoming ever more urbanized and interconnected. So not only are we growing in terms of population, but we're also growing in terms of infrastructure and importantly, the interconnection between different types of infrastructure, but also the interconnection between physical and social infrastructure. And then all of this is happening against a backdrop of unprecedented climate change. So climate change isn't just amplifying climate-related hazards, it's also amplifying vulnerability to other types of hazards like earthquakes, for instance, because it might be accelerating the aging process of different physical aspects of the built environment, for instance. So it's something that we need to think about regardless of the hazard that we're actually focusing in our risk assessment. And really all of this means that future earthquake risk mitigation planning is a generationally important issue. So if we look at the challenge in a little bit more detail, what we know is that we're expected to have around 2 billion new citizens in the planet by 2050. A lot of this growth in population is going to take place in the global south. It's going to be urban. And we're going to have a significant exposure to damaging, often interacting natural hazards, including, of course, earthquakes. And as I mentioned, climate change is going to make many natural hazard-related disasters worse. And it's typically the poor and the marginalized who suffer the most in terms of disaster impacts. Now, with this challenge, we do have an unprecedented time-limited opportunity to address this challenge. Because while we expect a lot of new citizens by 2050, actually 60% of the area that's expected to be urban by this time is yet to be built. So we can make decisions today that will significantly influence tomorrow's risk, okay? And so the idea is to make decisions that will mitigate tomorrow's risk. And we can do that through what we call risk-informed urban planning, design, and decision-making of our cities. And this risk-informed urban planning, design, and decision-making can leverage our conventional natural hazard risk modeling tools. However, in their current form, these natural hazard risk modeling tools are really limited in their ability to facilitate this type of urban planning process. And that's because, so first of all, let's think about what goes into a typical, let's say, seismic risk assessment, right? So we have some representation of the hazard, either deterministic or scenario-based, or maybe it's probabilistic representation of that hazard. We then combine that information on the hazard with information on what's exposed to the hazard, and typically we're focusing on the built environment in terms of exposure, and typically things like buildings. We then combine that information with the vulnerability of the built environment to the hazard, bring all of that information together and synthesize it into a set of probabilistic consequences or risk metrics. But what we tend to do is we tend to represent exposure and vulnerability in terms of a static representation. However, in reality, both exposure and vulnerability are dynamic. They're going to evolve in the future. They're going to change in the future, and they're going to be uncertain in the future. And really, if we want to use natural hazard risk models to inform risk-informed urban planning, we really need to integrate that evolving dynamic nature of exposure and vulnerability into our calculations. Furthermore, as I mentioned, we tend to quantify impacts of natural hazards like earthquakes on individual physical assets in the built environment, like buildings, when in reality our urban systems are actually interconnected sets of physical and social networks. And that really means that we end up characterizing risk in narrow terms like economic losses or repair cost percentages of replacement costs. And these types of risk metrics, they really don't capture the effects of natural hazards on everyone in society. So what we've done is we've tried to revolutionize or change the way we think about natural hazard risk modeling to make it more suitable for integration in risk-informed urban planning processes. So instead of focusing on static current exposure and vulnerability, we're incorporating information on tomorrow's evolving and dynamic exposure and vulnerability, and also tomorrow's multi-hazards. We're attempting to capture both physical and social networks in our representation of both exposure and vulnerability to these hazards. And that then enables us to characterize earthquake and natural hazard risk in what we call people-centered impact metric terms. So I'll come back to that people-centered impact metric term later on in the presentation, but really what I'm talking about here is being able to characterize risk in terms that captures the effects of natural hazards on everyone's daily life, not just those who have the most to lose in terms of economic losses. So what we've done is we've taken our new approach to natural hazard risk modeling and we've set it within what we call a decision support environment for facilitating risk-informed urban planning of the future. Now, this decision support environment was developed as part of a UK government-funded project that I was involved in, and it really contains a number of steps towards facilitating that urban planning process, and all of those steps are oriented to an extent around that risk modeling approach that I just described. So it's very people-centered, it's very participatory, and you'll see how through the following slides. So basically, this decision support environment starts with what we call a future visioning process. Now, this future visioning process is really laying the foundations for the future exposure inputs to our risk modeling approach. So here we go to local stakeholders in the given urban context where we're interested in risk-informed urban planning, and we ask them to tell us what type of future city they would like to have. And so they express their desires, maybe in terms of having different types of facilities or different types of policies in place. And then we take those desires and we try to represent them formally in geospatial data sets, which we call visioning or urban scenarios. Now, these urban scenarios will be underpinned by objective measurements like urban growth projections, just to ensure that the future visions expressed by the stakeholders are realistic when they're represented in these geospatial data sets. So really, these future visioning and this urban scenario process, they form the inputs of the future exposure and vulnerability components of our risk modeling approach. Then what we would do is we would subject that future exposure stored in the urban scenario to a set of specific hazards of interest, run through our risk modeling calculations, and compute risk in these people-centered impact metric terms that I mentioned. So again, we're talking about capturing risk in terms that are relevant to everyone in society. So not just economic losses, but things like loss of access to healthcare, for instance. And we bring these impact metrics back to the original stakeholders involved in the future visioning process, and we sort of educate them on the implications of their desires in terms of the natural hazard risk that would be associated with those desired future visions in the future. It also gives stakeholders and local community members an opportunity to express their perspectives and their priorities around the different impact metrics. And those expressions are included in our characterization of risk, and that will become clearer later on in the presentation. Then the last part of the decision support environment involves bringing our findings, the lessons learned around this process to higher level stakeholders, like maybe government authorities, and to really kind of educate them on this process of risk-informed urban planning, and to hopefully encourage them to actually implement this type of risk-informed urban planning process in practice. Okay, so let's delve into some of the details of this whole type of process. So starting off with the hazard modeling component of the process, right? So typically risk models will consider just single hazards, whereas here we're trying to capture multiple hazards. But let's start off with single hazards first of all. So what we're advocating for here, and this is not my core expertise, but I do work with a group of hazard modelers, is to use physics-based representations of the hazard. So very, high detailed, high fidelity, physics-based modeling of hazard. Now, what we also typically do here is we're not thinking about hazard in probabilistic terms, but we want to use a scenario-based hazard assessment. So just looking at specific earthquakes. And the reason for this is that we found from our interactions with stakeholders, but also in the literature, that scenario-based hazard assessments tend to be more tangible and more meaningful for stakeholders in terms of decision-making. So again, it's not just earthquakes that we're looking at in isolation, but we want to capture all, or at least the most relevant hazards for a given urban context. So these are just models of different hazards that we've done for a virtual urban testbed that we developed in the Tomorrow Cities project. And what you can see with these kind of very detailed hazard models is there's definitely spatial correlation between the hazards in terms of where the highest amplitudes of the hazards exist. So you can see close to the river in the floodplain, we obviously have flooding, but we also that also coincides in space with highest shaking from the earthquake. Now, how to basically include multiple hazards in a risk assessment, I think, is still a very much an open research problem. How do we aggregate risk from various different hazards, considering that they occur perhaps independently. So what we have done so far in our risk modeling approach is to actually treat them independently and to compute risks separately for different hazards, but also making sure that we do compute risks for different hazards. We're not just looking at one of the single hazards in isolation. However, again, as I mentioned, this might change in the future in terms of how we kind of aggregate risk, but also account for the probability of different hazards occurring simultaneously, or at least close in space and in time. So in summary, we have these fairly highly detailed representations of the hazard in the local context, which we then apply in our risk models. So let's talk a little bit about that future visioning scenario, that first step in the decision support environment, where stakeholders come together to express their desires around their ideal future city. So we might have desires in terms of wanting more schools in a particular area, or wanting more different types of jobs, or wanting more different types of businesses, for instance. Now, what we do with these desires is we synthesize them into a set of policy bundles. Okay, so these are representations of policies that we could implement in this future city in order to represent the perspectives of all of these different stakeholders. So the information that's recorded in these policy bundles reflecting the desires of the stakeholders are then translated into geospatial data sets within the urban scenarios component. Now, as I mentioned before, we want to make sure that these urban scenarios, these representations of the future, are indeed realistic. So we're not just considering the desires of the stakeholders, we also need to consider where natural hazards are likely to occur. We want to avoid development in those areas. We also want to consider where urban growth is likely to take place. What are the overarching socioeconomic trends in a given area? And then all of this information gets distilled down into what we call conditional urban plans. And this gives us a set of possible futures that we can stress test through our risk modeling approach. So let's go into some of these aspects in a little bit more detail, starting off with land use projections. So part of the work in my group has been to conduct like urban growth projections for Kathmandu Valley in Nepal. And the main findings from this work is that there will be significant urban growth within Kathmandu within the next 30 years or so. Now, what we did in order to project or probabilistically model this urban growth is to use a sleuth model. So a sleuth model is a cellular automata model that basically uses historical maps to predict future land use in a probabilistic way. And the name comes from the inputs required from the model. So we need inputs related to slope, land cover, excluded areas, urban land, transportation, and hillshade. And then there's a number of growth rules within the model. And the parameters of the model are calibrated based on historical data for the area of interest. So these are just some of the data that we used for the Kathmandu application of the sleuth model. Okay, so next up, when we've kind of established realistic parameters for these urban scenarios, we've also reflected the desires of the stakeholders, we end up with this conditional urban plan. And this conditional urban plan is really the exact exposure input to the future risk modeling engine. But in a departure from conventional approaches to exposure, we're not just capturing individual buildings within this future urban area. What we want to capture is the individuals and the households that also occupy this urban area. And again, we're not looking at the buildings and the physical infrastructure in isolation from the social infrastructure. Instead, we want to account for the correlations between the physical and the social structure. So what we've done is we've developed a framework that will allow us to capture the interdependencies between people and the built environment. And you might have seen some of these models maybe previously in transportation modeling, for instance. What we're doing here is more detailed than conventional approaches to capturing these interdependencies, because we're not just capturing, generic people and their dependency on generic places within the built environment. We're capturing very detailed characteristics of the people in terms of, for instance, their gender, their age, their income, but also crucially detailed characteristics of the built environment and its specific vulnerability to the hazards of interest. So we start off this type of method with a population synthesis. So this is generating a hypothetical data set of people with prescribed characteristics that match a real population. So those characteristics are what I mentioned, like gender, age, and income. We then spatially merge that synthetic population with information on the built environment and its vulnerability to different hazards. And we use what we call linkage models, so human residence linkage models and human non-residential building linkage models to do this. And what we ultimately end up with from this process is a spatialized population involving detailed characteristics of each person and detailed understanding of how each person depends on the built environment, as well as the vulnerability of that built environment to whatever hazards are of interest. So here's just a kind of a representation of a characteristics associated with the synthetic population, and then how this gets translated into not just characteristics of people, but also how those characteristics depend on characteristics within the built environment. So we've kind of built both of these models using Bayesian networks, and the type of information required to populate these models includes, for instance, census data, household travel surveys that allow us to understand where people go throughout a given day, and property valuation data to kind of inform the vulnerability characteristics of the built environment. So what we ultimately end up with is a population for which we know how they go about their daily life and which aspects of the built environment they specifically depend on. So the kind of ultimate output of the urban scenario process is not just one representation of the future involving the detailed understanding of people and the built environment, but multiple representations of the future, accounting for all of the uncertainties that underlie that future representation of the population. Okay, so we are uncertain about the people that will inhabit that future urban context. We're uncertain about the buildings that will exist within that future urban context. And we're also uncertain about the interdependencies that exist between people and the built environment. So we have to capture all of those uncertainties. And we do that using a simulation-based approach, sampling many different possible configurations of the future urban scenario. Then on to the vulnerability of the built environment. So some of you might know we tend to characterize vulnerability to the built environment using fragility models in the case of earthquakes. So these are models that for a given intensity of ground shaking tell us how probable damage is to various different aspects of the built environment, and the shape of the curve will depend on the characteristics of the built environment. So what we need to do in our modeling procedure is to select appropriate models for the built assets that now populate our urban scenarios. And we've developed a formalized methodology for selecting the most appropriate vulnerability models for physical assets in a given environment. So here's just kind of an overview of this selection procedure. It starts with understanding what we have in terms of what assets are present in our urban scenario, what hazards are we interested in characterizing their vulnerability to. Then from a database of seed, fragility, or vulnerability models, we need to screen in order to make sure, in order to check whether within this database we do have appropriate models, so they are appropriately representing damage and appropriately representing impact in the terms that we want it to. There's available documentation on these models, so we trust these models, for instance. We then score the candidate models that result from this screening process. And here we're scoring them in terms of their relevance, in terms of their statistical refinement, and also in terms of their model quality. And then ultimately, the models that score the best from this procedure are then assigned to the assets within our built environment for the risk modeling procedure. Now, of course, if there is no appropriate models available in a compendium that exists currently, we will have to think about developing bespoke models for the built assets of interest using, empirical data or numerical approaches. So now we've characterized a future hazard, we've characterized future exposure, and we've characterized future vulnerability. So what's left for us to do is to bring all of these things together to characterize future risk. And as I mentioned, we seek or we strive to characterize risk in terms of these people-centered impact metrics that go beyond the traditional economic loss metrics typically used in earthquake risk modeling. So we can see through the pictures that I show here, we could have a similar amount of economic loss associated with damage to that one structure on the left-hand side in a global north context, and damage to so many of those structures on the right-hand side, okay? So in a global south context. So, together they might actually result in the same amount of economic loss. However, on the left-hand side, obviously, there would be significantly less people affected than what I'm showing on the right-hand side. Okay, so we need to go beyond these economic losses to be able to more accurately capture the effects of hazards on everyone in society, as I mentioned, not just those who have the most to lose in terms of economic loss. So we bring together the multi-hazard models, the infrastructure impacts using the vulnerability models that we selected in the previous step, account for the dependencies of people on that built environment using the framework for capturing interdependencies that I mentioned, bring all of this information together, and we can get a set of people-centered impact metrics which measure, for instance, accessibility losses to various important facilities for people within the urban context after a disaster. Okay, so we're going from economic losses to these people-centered impact metrics, as I mentioned. So we're looking at the number of people displaced, the number of people with no access to education, the number of people unemployed, or the number of people with no healthcare. Okay, so you can think about that previous slide where I showed, one house versus a huge amount of buildings in a global south context. Again, they could have given us equivalent measures of economic loss for a given hazard event. But if we measured instead the risk or the impact in terms of the number of people displaced or the number of people with no access to education, those two pictures would have given us very, very, very different magnitudes of those other types of impacts. Now, within our group, we've developed our own bespoke people-centered impact metrics. So here I'm talking about a model that we developed for predicting household displacement after earthquake disasters. So the idea of this model is that we have an earthquake that occurs. We model then the impacts of the earthquake on the built environment, like workplaces, homes, infrastructure networks. And we then make use of actual direct stakeholder input on what drives them to displace after earthquakes. This gets trained, so we train a data-driven model using stakeholder responses from previous earthquakes. So in this case, we used longitudinal survey data after the 2015 Nepal earthquake. And that allows us to predict for a given earthquake the likelihood or the probability that somebody will be displaced after that event. And what we found is that in our model, it's not just residential damage or any physical damage that causes people to be displaced, but they're also displaced. Their decision to displace will also depend on, for instance, their attachment to their location, any financial assistance offered by the government, and the specific characteristics of the household, so the age and the gender of the household, for instance. So we developed this method for quantifying population displacement using a random forest modeling approach. But we don't want to just, develop a limited set of these people-centered impact metrics. We also wanted to kind of provide a generic approach for anyone to follow in order to characterize any people-centered impact metric that might be interesting or relevant to their context for decision-making. So what we did is we developed this disaster impact metric pyramid, which provides a conceptual representation of societal dependencies, and it can be sort of used as a guide for characterizing any people-centered impact metric of interest. So the pyramid starts with kind of the foundational blocks of society, which is the physical and the natural environment. That physical and natural environment then influences social and economic infrastructure like mobility services, utility services, and we kind of take damage to the bottom layer, its disruption to the middle layer, and synthesize all of this information, and we can get any type of impact metric of interest. So in order to get damage to the bottom layer, so damage to transportation or buildings, for instance, we use our fragility models. We then translate that disruption into, or we translate that damage into disruption to social and economic infrastructure using damage to impact models. And finally, we synthesize that information into some sort of indicator to get a specific disaster impact metric of interest. So for instance, we could think about somebody wanting to understand loss of access to food at a household level 2 weeks after a given earthquake disaster. So what we might do is come along, look at this pyramid and understand, okay, first of all, I need to understand what was the damage to transportation, what was damage to utilities, what was the damage to buildings, etc. Then I need to understand how to translate that damage into disruption to relevant social and economic infrastructure in this case. So relevant infrastructure would be, for instance, food services, mobility services, utility services, and telecommunication services. And then I need to combine all of that information together to get a loss of access to food at the household level. So another important aspect for us is not just characterizing any set of people-centered impact metrics, but making sure that the impact metrics we are characterizing is actually relevant for decision-making in a given context. So what we really want to understand when we're implementing our risk-informed urban planning approach is really what impact metrics matter to stakeholders in that context for the decision-making processes of interest. So what we did is we actually developed structured questionnaires, and we distributed these structured questionnaires to a number of stakeholders in Kathmandu, Nepal. And we asked them their perspectives on 59 disaster impacts that were actually derived from that disaster impact metric pyramid I showed on the previous slide. So what we found is that, okay, of course, it depends on the stakeholder and the temporal and spatial dimension we're talking about. But really, stakeholders are most interested in understanding fatalities and injuries that result from natural hazard disasters, including earthquake disasters. They're also interested in understanding what happens to access to drinking water, to food, to utility services, and to required healthcare. Now, what's interesting about these findings is that these are not the types of metrics that we typically capture with conventional natural hazard risk models. So really what these findings are telling us is that these people-centered impact metrics are important to consider, are important to characterize, and are ultimately important to be including in our risk modeling approaches. So that stakeholder input is a really central feature of our risk modeling approach. I kind of hinted at this previously, but really for us, risk is not just an objective measurement of impact using those people-centered impact metrics I discussed previously. It's actually a subjective experience for different people involved in a risk modeling process. So we also need to consider not just the magnitudes of these impact metrics, but also the subjective priorities that different stakeholders place on these impact metrics. So it's a combination of the subjective priorities and preferences of stakeholders for mitigating these impact metrics, as well as the magnitudes of the impact metrics themselves that ultimately characterizes risk. So if we're trying to decide which urban scenario leads to the lowest level of risk, we need to incorporate into our calculations, of course, the objective measurements of the impact metrics, but also a subjective measurement that accounts for the priority stakeholders place on different types of impacts in order to understand which urban scenario ultimately leads to the lowest level of risk. So let's just go through kind of a pretend demonstration of this approach, just to make it a little bit clearer. So let's say we have a hypothetical set of stakeholders and we ask them about two specific types of impact metrics: the total population that's displaced after a particular earthquake disaster, and also the disproportionate extent of monetary loss due to residential damage experienced by low-income groups. So these are the two impact metrics that we're considering, and we want to understand how the stakeholders would prioritize these two impact metrics. Which one are they more interested in mitigating relative to the other? So in this case, we find that actually the stakeholders place equal emphasis on mitigating both of these impacts. And this information helps us to characterize risk. So let's say we apply this information to a hypothetical context where we have three policies that are being tested. And we can think of these three policies as being three possible, or underpinning three possible urban scenarios that we're considering building in the future. And we want to understand which of these urban scenarios leads to the lowest level of risk. So we can see from our calculations, so we might have done a calculation involving some specific earthquake hazard. We've captured our exposure, our vulnerability in our urban scenarios. And our risk model, our impact calculations tell us that, well, the urban scenario associated with policy 3 leads to the lowest amount of population displaced, and policy 3 is written over on the left-hand side, so it's around providing post-disaster assistance, financial assistance to various different stakeholders, whereas policy 1 actually leads to the lowest amount of disproportionate loss to low-income residences. So the first thing to think about, or to see here from this analysis is, okay, it's hypothetical, but what it's showing is really the way in which we characterize risk has a direct influence on decision making. Okay, so if we had just characterized risk in terms of population displacement, then we would have determined that the urban scenario associated with policy 3 is the best. However, if we were looking for a sort of a more equitable approach to disaster risk reduction, we would have gone for the urban scenario associated with policy 1. So it's really important to characterize risk in terms that are relevant for the decision-making context of interest. Now, if we combine this information, so these objective measurements of impact with the subjective preferences of stakeholders, what we would ultimately decide is to proceed with urban scenario 1. However, if instead we had gone to the stakeholders and they had told us, well, actually, we're much more interested in mitigating population displacement compared to disproportionate impacts of residential damage on low-income households, what we would have found in that case is actually that the best scenario to go with is the one associated with policy 3. So this really underlines the importance of incorporating the subjective aspect of risk into our risk models and into the decision-making process. So that Tomorrow Cities decision support environment has actually been implemented in a number of cities in the Global South. And on the right-hand side is a snapshot of the risk modeling engine user interface that we have. And on the bottom here, so here we're showing a specific urban scenario in Nepal. It's been subjected to a specific hazard event, and on the bottom is a series of impacts associated with that hazard on the specific urban scenario. So each of those icons corresponds to a specific people-centered impact metric that we've incorporated into our risk modeling engine. So just a few snapshots of our work across the world. So here's the future visioning process in Dar es Salaam on the left-hand side, and that risk dashboard that I showed in the previous slide being displayed to various stakeholders in different cities for educating them on the implications of their desires for the future in terms of risk, and also some high level in interaction with stakeholders in Nepal in terms of action planning on actually implementing this type of urban planning practice in real life. So some accomplishments to date. So the decision support environment, including that future risk modeling engine, it's been used to guide informal settlement upgrading in Nairobi. It's been used to revise strategies for improved earthquake resilience in Istanbul. And it's actually being used to inform national risk management policy in Nepal, as well as promoting inclusive planning in a number of different cities across Nepal. So if you want to learn more about that specific project, you can use the QR codes on the bottom of the slide. So I just conclude with a couple of things. So what I presented here was an end-to-end simulation-based framework for modeling risks associated with future earthquakes, but it can also be used for any other natural hazard of interest as long as we have required hazard modeling information and also the vulnerability information that's necessary. So what we've seen is that the framework advances the state of the art in earthquake risk modeling by capturing tomorrow's risks and their inherent uncertainties, accounting not just for physical aspects of the built environment, but also crucial interdependencies between people and that built environment, and incorporating participatory approaches to risk measurement. So really interpreting risk as a subjective measurement and making sure that our risk modeling calculations reflect this and so can be used for the best informed urban planning possible. Okay, so thank you very much for listening, and I'm very happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much. What an excellent talk. I realize I never put the link to the suggestion box in the chat, so I will do that now while people have time to write their questions. But we already have one from Jessica Velasquez. who says, in your test case, you use a synthetic data set for population details. How do you see this type of spatial breakdown availability for real data from many countries of interest? Or do you think that needs to be pushed forward to collect in order to deploy this methodology?
Yeah, so that's a great question, Jessica. In general, like this is it's a very kind of nice methodology, but it is really, really data intensive, as you can see. So, and yes, we were using test cases. We have actually deployed that synthetic population approach and the approach for capturing interdependencies in a real context, which is Christchurch, New Zealand. Now, of course, that's possibly, one of the richest countries in terms of data availability. So it's kind of a tentative step into the real world as such. We have been able to find appropriate information in that case. So using available national travel survey data, available census data, available microdata population samples as well, and some property information, we were able to do it. Of course, that type of information is less available in most contexts, and particularly in the global south. So what we've done is we've kind of come up with a different, how do I explain it? So we have kind of levels of implementation of this methodology that are possible depending on the data that we have. And so what we've done in some of the global south contexts is we've gone directly to relevant stakeholders and kind of asked them to estimate the underlying population or probability distributions that are required to populate that type of data set. So I would say that, yes, a lot more work is needed to be done in terms of data availability to fully implement this in practice in most contexts. But I think, showcasing what is possible if we do have the information available should hopefully encourage people to publish this more often.
Thank you very much. We have another question from Marcial Contreras Zazueta, who says, thank you. The impact metrics you mentioned can be very detailed, but they still depend on the initial assumptions for the model. Could you elaborate on how you reduce the sensitivity of the results to the inherent uncertainties of the input?
Yeah, so again, that's an important question. I think what we try to do is we try to capture multiple possible representations of the future. So we end up with like multiple possible representations of these impact metrics in order to give stakeholders an idea of the possible ranges of the impact metrics in terms of magnitude. But I think ultimately, like what's important to take away from this type of work isn't necessarily the actual magnitude of the impact metrics, because the world is so uncertain, and the idea that we're able to really quantify exactly how much people are impacted by a specific event in the future is not really the idea behind our work. It's more to understand kind of relative differences between impact metrics, which I think is a more reliable measurement from what we're modeling.
Great. Jessica Velasquez has followed up. Thank you for the answer. Yes, New Zealand is a great playground data-wise. Showcasing what is possible can be a great push to show what data would need to be collected and motivate groups, municipalities, et cetera, to collect it. Without the frameworks, what types of data specifically need to be collected is unknown. So thank you for showing what can be done given the required data. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Heather Kroom also has a question. Thank you for the interesting talk. Does the model account for differences in individual countries, or are future developments grouped and treated similarly across regions? For example, are fragility curves tailored to specific countries, or are they generalized?
Yeah, Heather, that's another great question. So really, again, it depends on the data availability. So ideally, what we would like is to have everything very, very context specific. So we've got a set of bespoke fragility models for a given region, and we've got a bespoke exposure model in general, right? I think in terms of the exposure model, like, yes, it definitely has to be context specific. So we're not just kind of grabbing an exposure model from one place and kind of implementing it somewhere else. On the vulnerability modeling side, particularly the fragility modeling side, the idea of that kind of formalized methodology for selecting vulnerability models was to take advantage of global vulnerability databases that have been developed. So we would be kind of implementing models potentially developed for other contexts into a given context. Now, again, that's not the most ideal case. However, we do have to deal with the reality of places not being able to, they don't have the resources to develop models from scratch. However, again, I think, the ability to sort of showcase what is possible and with kind of global vulnerability models, and then to tell people, if you want more refined calculations, if you want more refined results, we're going to have to do bespoke vulnerability models. That's kind of our approach at this stage.
Thank you. I'm not seeing any more questions at this moment, so I just want to remind everyone that this talk will be posted on the SZ4D YouTube channel after this later today, so feel free to share it with your friends and colleagues. And if a question comes to you later, feel free to email us and we'll pass it along. If there are no more questions, I want to thank you, Gemma, again for this wonderful talk and for taking the time to present your work to us today. Thank you everyone for attending and for asking your questions. Thanks again, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Julia. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.